Good morning, friends. Welcome to WordofGord OBEJournal 2018 and number 12, or the next one after the last one. We talked about Focus 35, and we experienced a human being from the future in that vibrational level. I'd say first identified by the explorers and programs from the Monroe Institute. Perhaps Bruce Moen. I'd have to check the references exactly. But that's where I first learned of it some years ago. And it seemed to be an area where sentient beings from almost anywhere in the universe, including our future, could park themselves and observe the changes that the Earth and its inhabitants were going through, and as we're still going through. And it doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon, as the great storms hit the Carolinas and the Philippines, I guess. That's the latest. Millions evacuated. Now, I suppose that brings up the debate about whether the global warming and man's contribution to it are actually causing more storms or longer storms or more intense storms. And the last opinion I heard from some self-defined experts was that they were causing more intense storms, more rain, and i.e. flooding, and then more ability to, shall we say, hover over a certain area rather than race through. But I get the feeling the jury's still out on whether they actually cause more storms per year. But one hears different opinions, and one is never quite sure. Not that one wishes to be quite sure, particularly. But there you go. It's happening, and we can't avoid it. And that people in certain areas certainly cannot avoid it. But it does seem to be the areas where they regularly get these kind of tornado, hurricane type storms anyway. There's certainly more water around. Whether you're looking at rain coming from the sky or water in the sea. That melted ice from the poles. And it's got to go somewhere. It seems to be in the nature of the elements, is to move around and change form. And without becoming too much of a philosopher on that particular point, the Earth changes. And certainly that includes much more than merely climate change. There are many of those who would philosophize on what that all means, and maybe I'll throw in my 2 cents. One of the aspects, I believe, is that we are realizing that we are, as humans, right now, intrinsically part of the aura of Gaia, of the consciousness of the planets, that we contribute to it. We are not set apart from it, as we may, as our earlier consciousness, our consciousness of being an isolated ego in competition with all other isolated egos for, shelter, food, status advantage. It's not uncommon to see people now either espousing or what's the word, identifying with the notion that we are all one. I see it often enough on the internet, that's for sure. And although there is many elements of divisive consciousness still available to be experienced and ready to take you on that journey if you still feel like it. But the notion that we are all one has found its place in world culture. It may be a small place at the moment, but I believe it is it is expanding. And whether it's in, banging about in the New Age community as a meditation or a book title, or it's being hymned in pop songs or classical music. It's there. So that's part of the earth changes, I believe. Growing to feel that our thoughts and emotions and intention are part of Gaia's progress, shall we say, although progress is a bit of a tricky term. We are not strangers on this planet. We are not visitors. Others are visitors. Well, we're not. We've been here a while. Although, I guess metaphysically, we are visitors. We came a long, long time ago. And we've been here for quite some time. Tens of thousands of years and longer. The recent visitors, of course, are visitors. And they're the ones that are mostly curious about what we're going through, either because they haven't been through it, or they have been a long time ago and wish to survey how we handle it compared to how they handled it. This notion of the transcendence of individual consciousness and into a perception of international consciousness or intertribal consciousness, consciousness that transcends all ethnicity and belief system. The we are one consciousness, which of course we can also extend to the animals and the elemental beings and the forms of nature. I was thinking about the forms of nature, the elemental forms, the other day with the excitement, a very, very, very brief projection of consciousness into the, how shall I say, spirit of the storm then approaching the Carolinas. And very exciting it was too, just a few seconds. And those, incredibly intense swirling winds, just for a small example, they all have spirit beings within them. The spirits of the wind, the spirits of the upper atmosphere. And you may recall, if you've been following my blogs and videos, a piece I did trying to understand how the spirits behind these intense tropical storms see themselves. And they're definitely, a small cog in a large wheel. And to use that metaphor, the devas, the overlighting devas that are hovering over many of the greater experiments on the planet, whether those experiments be a city or a large ocean or a mountain range or a intense tornado or hurricane. The devas have more of an understanding. They are not quite in charge, but certainly closer to being in charge than the small elementals that are participating, that are the how shall we say, effective beings that are the spiritual counterparts of the physical elements of any storm, or including fire, I might add. Plenty of salamanders in any forest fire. And you can check the names of all these sylphs, salamanders, undines. They're all there, and they have a perception of their usefulness and just sort of general life trajectories. But much different from ours, of course. They're not confined to a physical form, but they are confined to the systems in which they participate, for sure. They wouldn't think of being outside of them. Salamanders, they take rests between fires, but they sure get excited when they're in one, and it's irresistible to them. Just as one example. A fire to a salamander is as irresistible as an ice cream is to a 5-year-old child, let me tell you. So, the consciousness of the storm in Focus 35. I'll probably deal with a couple of those things today. And there's all sorts of people, listen to me, sentient beings in and around Focus 35, observing the Earth changes. And as I say, those Earth changes are more varied than we are usually led to believe. Earth is, Gaia is going through its own graduation, joining the more evolved, more ancient planets, I believe, like Saturn and Jupiter, but I'm no expert on this matter. Certainly not on that one. But one sees these references and one assumes them to be accurate. That Earth is something of a junior planet, not the most junior, and on its journey, as we are with it, to a greater and greater consciousness of its place in the Milky Way and the universe at large, although the universe at large admittedly is an awfully big place, and we are a tiny cog in a large interactive machine when it comes to the universe at large. Never mind the Milky Way alone, which is shockingly diverse. So understanding that we can, project our consciousness, bits of ourselves, without actually quitting the physical body, as the traditional astral travel model implies and executes. That's where you move out of your body, in your astral body, and you're up at the ceiling of your bedroom and you look down, and there's your physical form sleeping. Many of you have had that experience and would like to have it again, I'm sure. And I wish you well on that one. There's certainly no discouragement from me on that matter. I'm merely trying to show you other options in these series of OBE journals. So, given your openness to this, let us try. Let us do it. Project a portion of your consciousness, anyone will do, into this hurricane storm. It will now be over the sea and over the North Carolina area, I believe, on a fairly wide swath, and just project yourself into it. That part of yourself that is not afraid to do so. And understand that you are a spirit being, a spiritual energy. You're not physical. You will not be blown about or smashed as trees and buildings are. You are more like a bit of a knowledgeable ghost. So allow yourself to project into that and feel the intense energies that are, how shall we say, whipping about. I can see many of you are, and don't ask me how I can perceive this, because plenty of you are going to be watching this video days and weeks after its inception. But I seem to be in a place where I can transcend that time lag and feel your progress. Some of you are projecting into the storm, and you can certainly do it backwards in time too, as I've mentioned on many other journals. Backwards and forwards in time is no problem. But as is sometimes the case, part of you is in the storm, and the part of you that is at base camp, if you like, projecting, isn't quite convinced that you're there. And I encourage you to abandon that doubt for the duration. Well, I experience a certain giddy chaos as the energies surged in and through me. And don't forget, when you're doing that, you're not a physical being. You have no wind resistance. Um, you can certainly poise yourself in the middle, if you wish, and see it all whipping on around you, or feel it if you don't see it. Well, for me, that was a good exercise in understanding. I'm thinking of an old book title called Crowds and Power. The power involved in that, and the release of power and energy, and all the little beings that are being whipped around within it. I didn't feel myself that. I sort of not being whipped around so much as buffeted. Maybe that's a word. I'm not sure. And just personal perceptions. I'm not talking about any kind of base camp reality here. We're all experiencing different things, depending on our ability to open to the various energies. So there is no right or wrong way to do this. That's for sure. But that giddy chaos, you can see why they get so excited about it. And I refer you to that blog essay and that book by, dear no, The Real World of Fairies, it's called. Not sure I remember the author's name. Vera? I have a funny feeling it's a Vera, but I'm not sure. But definitely The Real World of Fairies. There's a chapter in there where she, the author and channeler, communicates with the various elemental beings that participate in the tornado. And I commented on it and tried to treat them as equals that had the same moral responsibility as we humans do, which I think as the various levels of beings on the planet merge in conscious understanding is something that elemental beings have to take on moral responsibility for the destruction they wreak. They definitely see it as even the younger, smaller beings, as opposed to the older, more mature devas. They certainly see the cycles of destruction and creation that go on the planet. But I always get the feeling they had not really much concept of the moral responsibility that they share for the destruction, because they're so attuned to their way of being and doing. They say that they will try to avoid or minimize the amount of suffering the destructive storms cause, but again, they have very little perception of what that actually means. Destructiveness and suffering, broken bodies, and broken families. And as we have to learn by absorption and opening and surrender to their mode of being, they owe us the same favor. And I'm not sure if we're going to get apologies from them down the line, as we see governments apologizing around the world at various times for poor, cruel treatment of indigenous people going back 100, 200 years. That's maybe a little pie in the sky to see Dave was apologizing to us. But they do have to learn moral responsibility. I can't see any other way if they're going to graduate from their lives into a greater understanding. And that's not to absolve us from any moral responsibility. That's certainly a given. And karma takes care of that for us, I would say. So after that little experiment in unification of consciousness with elemental beings that seem a little strange to our way of life, let's move on. Let's move up to focus 35, which, as I've said, is beyond all the levels of hells, heavens, purgatories, paradises. It's a more refined space, and I don't feel it to be a place where there's any form or landscape, merely subtler and subtler energies. And when you're there, you're not really in a form yourself. Maybe a light, and you certainly can take on form for the sake of an interaction. If you feel that you're open to that level of flexibility. So make yourself a being in focus 35. Allow yourself to become one of them, even though they're from elsewhere and we're from here. Share in their consciousness as they, not that they have one consciousness, but share in any bits and bobs of their consciousness that you can pick up as they observe the various earth changes over time, and observe them in us, how we are changing. Part of what I'm getting is this understanding or this perception that we, the humans alive now on Earth, are experiencing a transcendence bit by bit of our own limited personal consciousness. We are starting to see how we are related not only to our higher selves and other humans, but that we can exist on several levels at once. That the being on the physical plane, that basement of consciousness that I've often joked about, is quite vibrantly related, to use that term, to the other levels of consciousness that we inhabit at the same time as inhabiting the physical plane consciousness. We are multidimensional beings, and we exist on several levels at once. That notion is not so wild and crazy as it might have seemed 20 or 30 years ago. We are coming to a perceptive understanding of that, bit by bit. Imagine a 10-story building. Physical plane down on the first floor or the basement. And the other 10 floors are different levels of consciousness. Imagine existing in all 10 all at the same time. If 10 seems a bit much, imagine 3 or 4. But it's the many forms distributed around the levels that is something to behold and perceive. On some of those levels, we understand implicitly that we are one another. There's a perception that we are all one, as we've discussed, but we don't enter it fully. We understand the concept, but we are still strongly attached to our individual consciousness, who we are in this lifetime, our characters. And we're not willing to submerge those characters into the consciousness of the one. Not completely, anyway. We dip our toes in it, and we thrill to the notion, but we don't give up our old consciousness. We experiment with the new one. It would be much too scary to completely surrender to it, but it's not at all scary to walk up and shake hands with it. As a being, as a partial being, if you like, in Focus 35, we can also see, again, this is what I'm getting, how we, at a lower level, traverse the spirit planes when we're asleep. We can actually observe that. We see that part of ourselves rising up during sleep, whether conscious or not, consciously or not, and moving through various levels of vibration, of spirit world levels, and either interacting in a way that we choose or drifting about in a semi-dream state, as many folk do, picking up the vibrations but not really much of the consciousness and the actual perceptive abilities. We take the journey, but we don't see ourselves taking the journey. But yet, the part of us that's in Focus 35 can look down and see that and be, somewhat amused. As amused as, let's say, a mother busy in the kitchen watching her 3-year-old venture out for the first few times into the back garden through the back door that has been made easy for the child to push, and experiencing that world for a a few minutes and then coming back in. So on that level, we are children venturing gingerly and excitedly into the back garden for a few minutes and then coming back into the safety of mother cooking, those familiar smells of the kitchen. Our former rigidity of consciousness from, say, 200 years ago, where most of us did not interact in any serious way with other nations and other cultures. We stayed fast in our own country and our own customs and our own mode of being and our own assumptions and prejudices, some of which were shaken up by being soldiers at war, and sometimes not. Soldiers at war can absorb elements of the cultures that they're fighting with and in some way respect them, but very often they just feel like they're beating them down. Our culture is superior and we're beating down yours because it's inferior. But in those times, let's say 100 years ago, there was much less consciousness, friendly, understanding consciousness of other tribes and nations and cultures. There was a fearful, distrustful distance that was kept. And we see, looking down on ourselves now, that is much transcended in many areas on the planet, much transcended. And not just in the multicultural, multiracial cities of the planet. We do see progress towards oneness of consciousness on that level. So I'm sort of breaking this thing down into component parts and sort of pointing them out rather than a sort of a meditation where there's a sort of oceanic merging with all the elements and a feeling of oneness without sort of spotlighting the various elements of that oneness. I believe it's appropriate and helpful, and I hope you do too. We are one another. We are bonded to our other projections, our other modes, our other focuses of consciousness. I find that a useful phrase. On each level, we are a focus of consciousness within a body, but the body is the car that carries that focus of consciousness. It is the focus of consciousness. The passenger, the driver, that is important. And as we move about and project on various times and on various levels, that's what we're doing. We're projecting our focus of consciousness into other focuses of consciousness. And coming to understand how they feel, how they operate, how they understand. Rather like chatting with a complete stranger at a fast food counter while you gobble your way through your lunch. If they come from another country and another culture but can speak your language, then you can share. And you can marvel at the strangeness of their cultural ways. This is an element of what we're going through as we move toward the unification of consciousness, the understanding that we are all one, and that in that consciousness we can still celebrate our marvelous individuality. We are simultaneously minor deities and busy mechanics, fixing the various misperceptions of our limited consciousness. And with that thought, I shall leave you, friends, and until next time.